In this lesson, we're going to take the time to learn about how to use context and servlet-specific init parameters, which can allow us to store some information right in the web.xml file that we could then use throughout our context or in specific servlets. The code for this is going to be available for you in the resources under City Manager Web Context Init Parameters.war file. It will contain everything that we've done so far with the City Manager, including the information on the servlets, init parameters, and context parameters. Again, just as a reminder, if you do choose to import the WAR file directly, you will need to rename your project to City Manager Web so that it does line up with the code mapping the URL paths as expected. What we need to do in order to make init parameters work is we need to modify our web.xml file. And we have two different types of init parameters that we can use, which exist on the servlet level. And one of them will be specifically for the servlet, and one of them will be for the entire context. And so what we'll do is actually look at the web.xml file and make some changes there. And we're going to have two different servlets. One's going to be servlet parameters, and the other one will be servlet parameters 2. And these simple servlets are just going to show us that we have access to the context or servlet init parameters that we think we should have access to. So let's dive into the web.xml. And most of the web.xml is going to be the same as what we've seen before. The difference is going to be I've taken out some of the welcome files so that we don't have a bunch of them there. Just makes it easier to read. And now we're going to get the ability to add two different types of parameters. So the first one, within our servlet and our servlet mapping, you can see the servlet mapping is nothing new. That's just a servlet mapping with a variable name and then the URL pattern we want to match. And here again is our servlet variable name with its class that it's mapped to. But what you'll see here is we've also now added a init param into the servlet tag. So this goes directly into the servlet tag, and this of course means that this is for this servlet and this servlet alone. And you'll note that the parameter name is case sensitive. So here secret code has a capital C. That's very important to note. And you'll also note that whatever these values are, they are going to be just strings as they're passed around in the system. So you would need to modify that further as far as casting to integers if you expected that string to actually be an integer or whatever you needed to do to get the data that you're looking for. But with this init parameter, then I can, in this servlet only, grab the secret code and print that out. The other type of parameter is more of a global parameter for the entire application context. And so this parameter is actually going to live and be available to any of our pages or any of our servlets on the entire application for this context. And this one will be DB URL, a very good thing to store because a lot of pages may need to connect to the database. And the parameter value would just be a local string to get to the world database. Now, this is not set up to work or anything like that at this point, but it's a good starting point for us to just kind of start seeing things and have a valid parameter that we could potentially start working with at some future point. So that maps our servlet. The first servlet is servlet parameters mapped to servlet parameters.do. This is going to be very important in a moment. We'll show you that in a second. And then the other one is going to be available everywhere. So both of these servlet parameters should have access to the context parameter DB URL. So the code's going to be exactly the same or very similar in both. We're going to do the GET request, and each one's going to try to pull the secret code and the URL. Now here's the difference. The secret code is a servlet init parameter, so we get the servlet config. The DB URL is a context parameter, so we get the servlet context. Both of them are going to call get init parameter. So that method is the same, but what we're pulling from is different. So that's the most important thing to note. Of course, these have to match exactly what we put in there, case sensitive, in order to get that information. Now here we're in servlet parameters, so we should supposedly have access to both of those variables since the secret code is mapped to the servlet parameters. However, I want to point out, this servlet parameters does have a map tag as /servlet parameters. So if I run as /servlet parameters, what we're going to see is that we actually won't get access to that mapped servlet secret code. And then we'll have to actually hit the .do extension if we want to absolutely see that. And we'll see that in a second. We're just going to print out the secret code and URL as they're retrieved so that we'll be able to see that we do have, in fact, access to those different variables. Servlet parameters 2 is exactly the same. The difference here, of course, we're going to try to print out secret code, but we're going to expect that we don't have it. So we're going to go ahead and modify that to say unauthorized and still spit out the URL. So it just looks a little more friendly because we don't expect that this, in fact, we know, based on what we know, that this servlet will not have access to that secret code since that's not part of this servlet's mapping in any possible way. So let's run servlet parameters and let's take a look at what's going on here when we run this. So again, you can see as that ran, it printed out secret code is null, DB URL is JDBC MySQL localhost. you can see that our DB URL, our context parameter, worked just fine, which is great. That proves that we have access to that no matter what, and that's what we were expecting. We do also see, though, that the secret code is null, and we might be a little confused at this point, say, well, I mapped to servlet parameters, why is it null? And again, that's because when we mapped in the web XML, we did map specifically to .do. Now, we can't map them to both the same place, or we'll get an error and our Apache Tomcat container won't start. So we do need to have separate mappings, and that makes it so that the only way to get that servlet init parameter is to actually map to the same servlet URL pattern that you expected when you mapped it in your servlet in the web XML. Servlet parameters 2 is just going to be on the server here as well. And once again, that's going to be the one that we didn't expect any access. We modified it to say unauthorized. And we still have access to our DB URL, and that proves that in this context we have access to the context parameter, but not to the servlet init parameter, which we didn't expect to have.